It's 7 p.m. Wednesday, August 14th, here in Seoul.
Coming up on NEWSCENTER tonight. Korea remembers victims of Japan's wartime sexual slavery, marking the International Memorial Day for the euphemistically called comfort women. A new memorial statue was also unveiled. We have it all covered.
South Korea says it will actively respond to Japan's planned discharge of radioactive water contaminated from the 2011 Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster. Seoul is urging Tokyo to scrap the plan as Greenpeace says it will take less than a year for the radioactive wastewater to reach Korea's East Sea.
With hopes of helping small firms become more self-reliant amid rising global trade tensions, the South Korean government lays out measures to help such firms develop their own parts and materials.
And South Korea plans to increase defense spending to nearly $240 billion over the next 5 years to better counter threats from North Korea. Part of that money will be spent on anti-missile systems and warships. NEWSCENTER begins now. Good evening and welcome to Arirang NEWSCENTER, coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Noah Adam.
And I'm Han-daeun. Thanks for joining us. A weekly rally in Seoul demanding justice for the victims of Japan's wartime sexual slavery marked its 1400th edition today, with hundreds of activists gathering in front of the former Japanese embassy.
The protest came as Korea commemorates International Memorial Day for the so-called comfort women, and it also came on the eve of Korea's Liberation Day. Lee Min-sun starts us off.
Hundreds of people gathered at the weekly rally on Wednesday to call for Japan's sincere apology to the victims of wartime sexual slavery during World War II. This was the 1,400th weekly rally since they began 27 years ago. Despite all those efforts, the victims of Japan's wartime sexual slavery, often known as comfort women, still have not received a sincere apology and appropriate compensation from the Japanese government. Only 20 of the victims are still alive, and they are all very old, mostly in their 90s. This week's rally was held under the theme of backing the victims' voices and urging the Japanese government to hear them. In addition to August 15 being the eve of Korea's National Liberation Day, it's also the International Memorial Day for Comfort Women, designated by the Korean government last year. It marks the day when the late Kim Hak-sun, one of victims, made the first testimony in front of the public in 1991. This week's protest attracted a larger number of participants, partially because of the recent trade row with Japan. But the urge for justice and the correct recognition of historical atrocities is something that went beyond borders.
Japan should take the initiative to solve this issue, and Japanese people need to know the truth. The Korean victims didn't want to become comfort women for money, but the Japanese government is hiding the truth.
It's my first time participating at the rally because it's a school vacation. I was interested in the comfort woman issue. If we don't correct the issue now, the same problem will happen again. That's why we need to do this kind of movement.
During the 90-minute rally, participants made remarks to show their support and remember the courage of the victims to speak out. And the organizers shared a letter of solidarity from a North Korean group, which was delivered on Monday. To show global solidarity, similar rallies and events were held in 13 cities in Korea and 21 cities in 9 countries around the world, including the US, UK, New Zealand, Taiwan, and Japan. Lee Min-sun, Arirang News.
Also today, President Moon Jae-in has said he will do his best to restore the dignity of the victims of Japan's wartime sexual slavery. On Facebook and Twitter, the president sent out a message of appreciation to the victims and promised that his administration will do its best to restore the dignity and honor of those who lived through that tragic time in history. His government, he said, will do more to raise international awareness of the Korean women who were forced to serve as sex slaves by sharing the issue as a message about peace and women's human rights. The president thanked the victims for the efforts they've made and said that through them, the country was able to learn the truth and that he hopes that their sorrow will be turned into hope. Starting from the first bronze statue, which was installed in front of the then Japanese embassy in Seoul in 2011, some 120 comfort women statues have been built nationwide to remind people of the pain and suffering of the victims of Japan's sexual slavery. And today, on the Memorial Day for Comfort Women, a new statue was unveiled to call for Japan's apology once again. Our Won Jong-hwan was there.
Seoul held the unveiling ceremony for the new memorial statue on Namsan Mountain on Wednesday afternoon. The commemorative statue was unveiled on the Memorial Day for Comfort Women, just 20 meters from the former site of a Chosun shrine. At the special event, around 200 people, including Yongsu, the youngest victim still alive, gathered to see this reminder of Japan's historical atrocities.
I am 92 this year, the perfect age to live my life and perfect to receive an apology from Abe.
These statues are the work of American sculptor Stephen White, the creator of the Comfort Woman Memorial that was erected in San Francisco 2 years ago. And all the production and shipping expenses for the statue were covered by a non-profit foundation based in California. It doesn't look like most of the Comfort Woman statues that we know. A life-size statue, each from Korea, China, and the Philippines, holding hands and staring, an iconic figure who first revealed Japan's past wrongdoings. The three girls are looking at the late Kim Il-sung, a former comfort woman who first publicly testified in 1991 about Japan operating an organized military brothel program during the war. A city official explained that the statue has some distinctive features, in that it was built low to the ground and that it is only completed when someone steps up to join hands with the three girls, hoping that the comfort woman issue won't feel as distant to visitors. The statue does not have a name, as it is left for the public to decide for themselves. And some of the visitors at the site pitched their creative ideas for the statue's name.
Her story is still ing August 14th because we think the comfort woman issue is an ongoing problem that has yet to be solved. I also wanted to add August 14th to remember today.
With her Hak-sun, because Kim Il-sung was the first comfort woman to give her testimony about Japan's wartime slavery. We wanted to let them know that we are with them by naming the statue with her Hak-sun.
For those of who would like to suggest a name for the statue, please submit an application via email by end of November. The form can be downloaded from the website of the Korean Council for Justice and Remembrance for the issues of military sexual slavery by Japan. The winning name will be selected in December. Won Jong-hwan, Arirang News.
South Korea's finance chief says the government will make sure to provide stable funding for the local parts and materials industries to cope with the Japan trade curbs. Following a meeting today of a consultation body between the rival political parties, the government and the private sector, Hong Nam-gi said the government is doing all it can to minimize the fallout on local firms and to provide immediate financial support. Hong vowed to use this as an opportunity to boost the self-reliance of local industries, as well as foster an ecosystem in which both small and big companies can prosper. And to do that, the government is thinking of setting aside a budget worth roughly $2 billion for the parts and materials industries. Hong said that all parties agreed to play their respective roles, that is, for the private sector to encourage companies to invest and develop technologies, rival lawmakers to pass the necessary bills, and for the government to provide financial support. With a sharp drop in the number of South Koreans visiting Japan due to deteriorating bilateral relations, the regional economies of Kyushu and Okinawa are set to be hit hard. According to the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, the amount of orders received for Korean group tours in Okinawa fell 80% on year for August and 90% for September. Many Korean travel agencies are shutting down their offices and cutting the number of employees. Flights to cities in Kyushu have also dropped significantly. Both areas are also seeing sharp cuts in the number of hotel reservations and duty-free sales. Okinawa and Kyushu had been popular tourist destinations for South Koreans, and both areas are highly dependent on tourism. Thursday is Korea's National Liberation Day. 74 years have passed since Korea's liberation from the Japanese colonial rule. But ties between the two Asian neighbors are plunging to new lows amid Japan's economic restrictions against Korea. Our Kim Mo-kyun now walks us through how it all began and shows us an expert's take on how things could get better.
Korea celebrates Liberation Day on Thursday, marking the 74th anniversary of August 15, 1945, when the peninsula was finally freed from Japanese colonial rule. Named Gwangbokjeol in Korean, which means the day when the light was restored, the day stands as a reminder of the resilience of the Korean people during those years of harsh treatment under Japan's occupation from 1910 to 1945. During the period, Koreans were forced to work in Japanese factories and were sent as soldiers to the front line. They were forced to adopt Japanese names, and tens of thousands of young Korean women were drafted as the so-called comfort women for Japanese soldiers. To this day, the victims of Japan's forced labor are still suffering from their traumatic experience. The remaining victims, most of them over 85 years old, still haven't received a sincere and direct apology from Japan. However, Germany, the perpetrator of the Holocaust, has addressed its wartime atrocities differently. The German government has shown remorse through both words and actions through time, earning the trust and respect of its neighbors.
Germany has been educating its youth about its past wrongdoing and consistently apologizing to its victims every year. It has been continuously working to show how it reflects on its mistakes through actions.
Germany's efforts are receiving more attention this year as Seoul-Tokyo relations have deteriorated further with Japan's imposition of trade restrictions against South Korea in July. Despite Tokyo's denial, South Korea sees this as an act of retaliation against Seoul's Supreme Court ruling last year that Japanese companies need to individually compensate victims of forced labor during World War II. Experts say the problem has become more complicated as it spread to the economic sector, adding that the row should be solved separately through a two-track policy.
It's impossible to completely resolve the historic disputes. So at this point, I think it's important to separate the past problems from the economic and security cooperation. Both countries will have to work on mending their ties diplomatically.
The expert also expressed concerns that the latest trade row could mean the decades-long improvements in Korea and Japan's view of each other would be taken right back to square one. Kim Mo-kyun, Arirang News.
Now, amid the continuing Seoul-Tokyo trade tensions, as we heard before, Korea marks the 74th anniversary of its liberation from Japan's colonial rule tomorrow, August 15th. Now, at the bottom of that trade friction lies decades-old historical issues that is yet to be resolved. The deep scars from Japan's wartime atrocities still upset many here in Korea. To hear more on the two nations' historical row from a foreign expert's perspective, Dr. Hannes B. Mosler, professor at Free University of Berlin's Institute of Korean Studies, joins us through Skype. Dr. Mosler, thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Now, let's wind the clock back a little bit. South Korea's Supreme Court ruled last year in favor of Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor, ordering Japanese firms to compensate them. Japan's trade curbs against South Korea are widely seen as retaliation to that ruling. How do you see Japan's move? Is it appropriate for one country to protest against another's Supreme Court ruling?
Well, of course, basically, Japan is free to protest against any other country's court's ruling. What is more important in this case, however, is that Japanese apparently is trying to prevent that Korean victims will be compensated by Japanese companies which have committed crimes against humanity. And this is a real big problem. I understand, of course, that it is very difficult for Japan to face its grim past, but this cannot be a reason for denying historical facts, and it also cannot be a reason for starting a trade war that can have even negative repercussions for the world market. And I just can say it's a pity that the Japanese government engages in these infamous tactics solely for holding up its distorted version of history and for avoiding taking responsibility for its past atrocities.
Right, now Japan argues that the 1965 Seoul-Tokyo Treaty settled all compensation issues of its wartime forced labor, while Korea argues individual compensations are still open for settlement. What's your take? Do you think the treaty settled all the issues related to Japan's wartime forced labor?
This is, of course, a very tricky question, but no, these issues are not settled at all. I'm quite sure about this. In the first place, back then in '65, the treaty was a dirty deal, you could say. In '65, then strongman Park Chung-hee, he wanted to make quick money, and the Japanese government wanted to have a plenary indulgence or absolution. That is what the deal was about. But even if we take the treaty as a legally binding document, even then we can say the rights for individual compensation claims are still open. And I will tell you why. The very first thing is back then it was the Japanese side, when negotiating the treaty, that insisted on designating the payments of the treaty as a independence congratulation fund, and explicitly not as a compensation for those atrocities during illegal occupation of the peninsula. And now they are talking the opposite. So it's absolutely contradictory. And also, it's very important to understand that the Korean victims, they claimed their compensation against Japanese companies and not the Japanese state. So one can argue that these claims are not covered by the treaty in the first place. And lastly, but very important, is also that we have to keep in mind that even the Japanese Supreme Court, in its 2007 decision on Chinese forced labor victims, reconfirmed once more that their individual rights claims for compensation remain intact. We have that on paper.
Right. Now, Germany has also had a pretty dark history, also in World War II. How has Germany resolved historical issues with the countries involved back then?
Indeed, Germany also struggles, always have been struggling, coming to cope with its past and also resolving the issues stemming from those German atrocities and injustices. But once Germany was pressed to tackle these very tricky problems, it indeed made efforts to work towards a solution. And the most well-known example here is the establishment of the foundation called Remembrance, Responsibility and Future. And its purpose was to financially compensate those victims of German atrocities and injustices. So the German government paid into the fund, and several thousand German companies also paid into the fund, which then amounted to a sum of 5.2 billion euros, out of which until now 1.6 million victims have been compensated. So of course still much work is to be done, but this way of addressing the problem seems to be also a viable way, or could be a viable way, for Japan and Korea to go about this very tricky issue. And as far as I know, did the Korean government indeed suggest to the Japanese government in a somewhat similar fashion to solve the issue, but the Japanese government rejected that. And I only can say the Japanese government has to come to its senses. It has to realize that the Korean people and the international community will no longer tolerate Japan hiding behind legal documents and a quite flimsy argumentation. It has to show responsibility.
Well, we certainly do hope that Japan can take some cues from Germany in resolving some historical disputes. Dr. Hannes Mosler, thank you for your time today and your insights.
Thank you.
The South Korean government is discussing plans to help support the local economy, including proposals to help small firms develop their own parts and components. This is part of efforts to make Korea more self-sufficient, with more trade restrictions taking effect, especially in the Asia-Pacific. Kim Hye-sung reports.
At an economy-related ministers' meeting on Wednesday, the Ministry of SMEs and Startups announced measures to help South Korea's small firms develop their own parts and materials in a bid to overcome rising global trade protectionism and trade tensions.
Japan's expert curves showed how an accumulation of technological capabilities can determine the nation's competitiveness. Our goal is to help local small and mid-sized firms achieve technological independence in materials, parts, components that are the foundation of future new industries' growth.
A consortium set up by the government will play a matching role so small firms can develop the specific parts and goods that big conglomerates need. To ensure continuity instead of a funding support for an average of around $80,000 a year, the Ministry of SMEs and Startups will provide up to 20 times that figure, $1.6 million over a 3-year period. 100 local small firms will be selected by the end of this year to develop tech-related materials and parts. A total of $160 million a year will be allocated for fourth industrial revolution-related industries like AI and biotech. Lastly, the government will strengthen industry-university research institute cooperation by increasing R&D joint cooperation from last year's 39% to nearly 50%. Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi also said the government will promptly start spending on some $14 billion in social overhead capital in the latter half of this year to help boost the local economy. The government will ease regulations in the construction sector and push for smart construction technology to enhance productivity and safety. Kim Hae-sung, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in met with the heads of his advisory panels at the Blue House earlier today to review the progress that's been made on various state policies. It was the first such meeting in 9 months. According to Cheongwade spokesperson Ko Min-jung, the president thanked the advisors for how they've been steadily changing Korean society. He also acknowledged the difficulties they may have faced due to differences with other departments. In the meeting, the participants addressed the need for creative, small-scale employment policies. They also discussed the importance of research and development. The head of the Presidential Committee on the Fourth Industrial Revolution said R&D is based on uncertainty, and so the country needs the strength to endure such uncertainty. President Moon has been emphasizing the need for more R&D to make local firms more competitive amid the trade dispute with Japan. South Korea's Defense Ministry has laid out a 5-year spending plan to strengthen its self-reliance on responding to North Korea's evolving missile threats. It includes new anti-missile systems and reconnaissance forces. Kim Ji-yeon with the details.
Seoul's Defense Ministry has laid out its midterm force enhancement plan, a blueprint for how the defense budget will be allocated during the next 5 years. A ministry official said on Wednesday the 5-year plan aims to improve the country's deterrence to nuclear and missile threats and build key military capabilities for the envisioned transfer of wartime operational control from Washington to Seoul, as well as implementing the Defense Reform 2.0. It predicts South Korea's yearly defense budget for 2020 will break the 50 trillion Korean won mark, roughly $41 billion for the first time. As a whole, the ministry estimates the national defense budget will increase incrementally by 7.1% per year to amount to $240 billion in 2024. From 2020 to 2024, the ministry plans to increase the related budget by 10.3% each year to better respond to nuclear and missile threats. That includes acquiring surveillance and reconnaissance forces which can help detect and identify signs of North Korea's provocations, using military reconnaissance satellites and intermediate and high-altitude unmanned aerial vehicles. At the same time, it plans to improve the defense capabilities of the Korea air and missile defense, designed to intercept ballistic missiles by upgrading the Cheolmae-2 and Patriot missile systems. To improve maritime security, it plans to acquire more Aegis destroyers and radar for early detection of incoming missiles, as well as submarines larger than 3,000 tons. Also, the ministry plans to adopt the SM-3 surface-to-air missile designed to intercept and destroy short to intermediate-range ballistic missile threats, as well as electromagnetic pulse bombs that can cause power outages by disabling electric grids. The budget is also being used to help the force apply technologies of the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, as well as develop local weapons to lessen the reliance on foreign weapons systems. And to improve the military's medical system and troops' welfare, it plans to invest a combined $495 million during the 5-year period. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
South Korea says it's going to respond actively if Japan goes ahead with its plans to discharge radioactive water from the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster. Tokyo may release more than 1 million tons of contaminated water into the Pacific Ocean as it claims the country is running out of storage. Lee Seung-jae reports.
The treatment of radioactive water stored in tanks in Fukushima has become the subject of intense international concern in recent months, including in South Korea, as reports say the Japanese government is considering releasing it into the Pacific Ocean. And now, South Korea, one of Japan's closest neighbors, says it will seek ways to deal with Tokyo's planned discharge.
We will work closely with institutions and countries in the Pacific Rim that will be affected and actively respond to any potential water discharge from the Fukushima plant.
Tokyo Electric Power Corporation, which manages the storage of the toxic water, says it will run out of space in 3 years. Greenpeace warned in a report earlier this year that South Korea will be among the nations most affected by any discharge. And with the IAEA General Conference to be held in Vienna in September, and the South Korea-China-Japan top regulators meetings on nuclear safety taking place in China in November, Seoul plans to raise the issue and consider other concrete actions. Asked about the possibility of South Korea boycotting the 2020 Tokyo Olympics over the matter, Seoul's Foreign Affairs Ministry did not provide a direct answer. Citing the same problem, a number of U.S. media outlets, including the Washington Post, have raised concerns over the safety of American athletes heading to Tokyo next summer. Since 2013, South Korea has blocked all seafood imports from 8 Japanese prefectures near Fukushima after it was found that contaminated water was leaking into the ocean. While Tokyo sought to challenge Seoul's decision by lodging a complaint at the World Trade Organization, the WTO in April ruled in Seoul's favor, saying the measures do not amount to unfair trade restrictions or arbitrary discrimination. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Now, if Japan releases highly radioactive wastewater from tanks in Fukushima, then it will take less than a year to flow into South Korea's East Sea. That's according to a senior nuclear specialist at Greenpeace, Sean Burney, who was speaking at a press conference at Seoul's National Assembly earlier today. He stressed that the issue of radioactive wastewater is the most serious of all the issues he wanted to address. While Tokyo Electric Power Company says it will run out of space to store the toxic water in 3 years, Burney said there is space at the Fukushima plant to install additional tanks. The expert highlighted that South Korea should request Japan scrap its plan to discharge the toxic water. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had an, quote, extended exchange of views on U.S.-China relations in New York with high-ranking Chinese official Yang Jiechi, according to the U.S. State Department. No details have been provided regarding the meeting on Tuesday local time, but it is speculated that the demonstrations in Hong Kong could have been on the agenda. Washington and Beijing have been on a standoff regarding the situation in Hong Kong, but both sides are hoping for it to be resolved without violence. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence has confirmed that Chinese troops are moving to the border with Hong Kong. U.S. President Donald Trump advised everyone should stay calm to resolve this issue. On the same day, China denied requests for port visits to Hong Kong by 2 U.S. Navy ships, according to the United States Pacific Fleet.
Arirang TV's special documentary in commemoration of National Liberation Day airs tomorrow morning. The program will take a closer look at the step-by-step developments in the South Korea-Japan trade war that was first triggered by Tokyo's export restrictions on South Korea. The documentary will also feature analysis from the Japanese perspective with the help of Japanese experts and includes interviews with notable figures such as former Prime Minister Hatoyama. Arirang's Park Se-kyung gives us a sneak peek.
Japan's export restriction on South Korea had triggered a full-blown trade war between the two countries. With the situation worsening by the day, how are conscientious Japanese experts analyzing the current circumstances?
Prime Minister Hatoyama, in your opinion,
Why do you think Abe administration removed South Korea from its whitelist?
In earlier years, Japan had always regarded itself as a nation that was superior to Korea and China and tried to distance itself from Asia while modeling itself the West.
What Prime Minister Abe is trying to do is that he's attempting to transform Japan into a militaristic nation. On the other hand, President Moon Jae-in wants to improve ties with the North. That does not sit well with Abe because it kills the flames of militarism, which he is trying to rekindle.
Amid a diverse array of suggested solutions and remedies, there is a common consensus that the path to reconciliation should always be kept open.
The important thing to note is that the relations between South Korea and Japan will always endure. The Abe administration is only a temporary problem. It's a temporary government. The people of both countries, on the other hand, will always be the same.
We must prevent the situation from worsening at all costs in the stage. The two governments must engage in national and intellectual discussion for the withdrawal of Japan's decision to remove South Korea from its whitelist.
Tune in to Beyond Confrontation, a special documentary that takes a deep dive into the issue from the moral perspective of Japanese experts, tomorrow at 7 a.m. 박세경, Arirang News.
Dozens of overseas Korean performing artists have gathered in Seoul to commemorate this year's Liberation Day. Spreading Korea's traditional performances in different parts of the world, these Korean artists from diverse countries can now perform in their ancestral homeland. Our Kan Young-woo has a story.
These Korean artists are from the 5 different countries their parents immigrated to: the US, China, Japan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. There are 40 of them, and they've come to their ancestral homeland to commemorate Liberation Day. Organized by Seoul's Jeongyo-gukak Cultural Foundation, the first World Overseas Korean Performing Arts Festival is taking place on Thursday and Friday.
This is great and it means a lot. We need to keep trying to let overseas Koreans know about our traditional culture. I believe it's an important mission.
Some cultural exchanges between South Korea and Japan have been cut off due to the recent tensions. But the Overseas Korean Performing Arts Festival has invited 5 teams from Japan to show that cultural exchanges at the civilian level should continue regardless of external factors.
When it comes to politics or historical issues, there are certain problems that need to be solved, which is important. But the arts could have a positive impact on such matters, so cultural exchanges between civilians should go on.
The main ceremony will begin at 2 p.m. on Thursday at the National Gukak Center. On the next day, there will be a workshop to help second-generation Korean participants become more familiar with Korea's traditional performing arts.
The organizers say they hope this opportunity can be the start of a new tradition of bringing overseas Korean performers together to help preserve Korea's cultural heritage. Kan Young-woo, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in has appointed a new vice finance minister and a deputy head of the nation's intelligence agency. Kim Yong-bam, the former number 2 at the Financial Services Commission, has been tapped as vice finance minister. The president picked Choi Yong-hwan, ambassador to Israel, as the deputy head of the National Intelligence Service. South Korea's export prices fell last month, although import prices rose. The Bank of Korea says export prices fell for the second consecutive month, down 0.2% from June, due to the falling prices of electronics goods exports. The $1 exchange rate stood pat at around 1,175 won against the greenback. Import prices rose 0.6% on month in July, mainly on higher global oil prices. South Korea's benchmark Dubai crude jumped over 2% on month to more than $63 a barrel last month. BOK Governor Lee Ju-yeol has received an A grade from Global Finance magazine for a second year in a row. The grade was also given to 9 other central bank chiefs on the magazine's Central Banker report cards. US Fed Chair Jerome Powell and ECB President Mario Draghi received A-minuses. Central bank chiefs are graded from A to F based on factors such as their ability to control inflation, their economic growth goals, and their management of interest rates. The Seoul Metropolitan Government will build an extra 266 libraries across the capital over the next 6 years to help citizens get easier access to information. In particular, the city says it's focusing on 5 new municipal libraries, which will serve as regional branches of the Seoul Metropolitan Library. Once complete, Seoul will be home to around 1,400 libraries, raising the number of library books per citizen to 2.4 from last year's 1.4. Officials say the expansion plan will mean all Seoul residents will live within 10 minutes walk from a public library. That has been your 3-minute news flash.
Seems like we will cool off a couple of degrees in the coming hours as another typhoon, Krosa, is bringing more precipitation on the peninsula.
For more details, let's turn to our Michelle Park at the Weather Center. Michelle.
Now, Typhoon Krosa is currently heading northwards and it's expected to make landfall in Japan around tomorrow morning. And by Thursday evening, the storm is expected to exit through the East Sea. Now, according to its projected trajectory, the storm will bring rain tonight to Jeju and the East Coast. Now, the rainy weather will pull the temperatures down a bit to the low 30s. Now, gusty winds of 30 meters per second will accompany the east coastal regions with up to 250 millimeters of rain through Friday. Now, meanwhile, Seoul and most of the inland regions will receive up to 60 millimeters of precipitation. Now, going over to our temperature readings, morning lows on Liberation Day will be similar to today, ranging between 24 to 26 degrees Celsius. Now, a rainy afternoon will set the daily highs to stay in the low 30s, with Seoul, Daegu, and Busan reaching up to 31 degrees Celsius, while Jeju clears up with a daily high of 30 degrees. I'll leave you with the weather conditions around the world.
Okay, that will do it for this edition of Arirang News. Thank you as always for watching.
News in Depth is next.